In less than 1 week, Americans will go to the polls in one of the most important elections of our entire lives.
US President Donald Trump in full campaign mode for the legislative elections that might shift the balance of power in Congress. What would that mean for American policies? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Americans will vote on November 6th on the legislative midterm elections. All the seats in the House of Representatives and a third of the Senate will be contested. It is considered the first political test of the Trump administration, and the president has spared no effort to win. Ahead of the vote, Trump holds rallies in 8 states, but the polls indicate that Republicans, the party of President Trump, will most likely lose control of the House, but keep the majority in the Senate. Well, to discuss the implications of this election, we welcome Rafael Bernal. He is a staff writer for The Hill newspaper. Also with us, Calvin Dark is a political commentator and president of the CD Global Strategies Group. From Philadelphia, the former speechwriter for President George H.W. Bush and co-founder and national leader of the U.S. Tea Party movement, Michael Johns, joins us. And here in the studio, Zhang is the Washington bureau chief for the Shanghai Wen Hui Daily. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Let's start in Philadelphia with Michael Johns. And Michael, we heard it there, the most important election in our lifetime. We've also heard some commentators and analysts describe these midterm elections as the most important in a generation. Do you believe that to be the case, and why?
I noticed that every election in my lifetime has been the most important election in our lifetimes, and that's just a reflection on the fact that all of these elections are hugely important. And this one is clearly as well, too. In many respects, I think it is a referendum on the president and the direction and policies of the country. And it's also a referendum on the Democratic political agenda that's emerged over the last 2 years, which hasn't always been clearly understandable, but has been critical of the president. And the American people, I think, facing a great economy in this country that's humming on all cylinders, and facing an American military and foreign policy that is generally stabilized, and a country that I think has restored pride in its direction, a lot of consumer confidence, I think is poised to give broad support to Republicans on Tuesday.
Calvin, we see very tight races in this election. As I pointed out, it was for the House of Representatives and a third of the Senate. Former President Barack Obama, he's been getting a lot of attention as well because he's on the campaign trail stumping for Democrats. Let's listen to part of what he had to say.
The real reason I came down to Miami, because this Tuesday might be the most important election of our lifetimes. Politicians will always say that, but this time it's actually true. The stakes really are that high. The consequences of any of us staying home really are more dangerous.
There you heard it again, the most important election in our lifetime. Do you agree with that? And if so, why?
Well, that was 2008 Obama. It was really good to see him back again. I do think that this election is really important. As we say, all elections are important. I think this one in particular for a midterm is important because people feel very strongly about what we've seen over the last almost 2 years. And even though President Trump isn't on the ballot, this is probably the most effective way that people who don't agree with what's going on can voice that opinion. So in the sense that I've never seen this much enthusiasm for a midterm election, it is important in that sense.
I guess it's important, Calvin, to express one's dissatisfaction with President Trump if you want to do that. But let's look at one scenario. The Democrats take over the House of Representatives. What changes in the United States?
Well, I think one of the things we can almost be guaranteed is that Congress will finally take up its oversight role. I've been really disappointed with the Republican-led Congress that even on issues where really key voices in the Republican Party disagreed with what President Trump may have said or wants to do, they may have said it on Twitter, but it didn't actually come through in hearings and, in kind of getting answers to questions that a lot of Americans want to know. So I think at a minimum, if the Democrats do take the House, we're going to see Congress finally taking over its oversight role.
Zhang, you are the Washington correspondent for one of China's major newspapers. What do you make of this upcoming election? And how much of an appetite is there in China for news about the election?
I think the ordinary Chinese people are not so much interested in this midterm election in Washington, but some, like professors, scholars, government officials are watching midterm election in Washington closely because, as you may have already realized, if the Democrats are going to take over the House, that will bring some policy changes in Washington, D.C., especially on US-China issue. I think China is especially looking at this trade dispute. What kind of role can the Congress play when this midterm election will be held? And I think that they are kind of very much interested.
Rafael, a key issue in this election is immigration. We heard it again yesterday on Thursday with President Trump holding this news conference in which he talked about immigration. He talked about the group of people walking through Central America, saying that they were heading for the U.S. border, that they were going to invade the U.S. border. How big an issue is immigration?
So that's an odd question because he's made it the key issue. Yeah. Democrats aren't focused on it. Right. And he has an issue that unites all Americans. It is true when he talks about a booming economy, the economy running on all cylinders, that lifts up everyone in the country. Right. The wages went up 3.1%, which is a massive increase compared to other periods, and yet he's made it about immigration. And it's interesting because we know that works for him and his base, and it did work in 2016. But in 2016, he had both immigration and Hillary Clinton. Now, if you remove Hillary Clinton and just have immigration and just run on immigration, well, we'll see what happens on Tuesday.
This might need, we might need some help here, Rafael, explaining this to an international audience. So one would imagine that the president would be talking about his wonderful economic numbers every day, talking this up, as you point out, it lifts everybody. If he's talking about immigration, he's talking to his base, but these are people who are already going to vote for him, right?
One would assume.
He needs to convince the people who are independents, who are undecided.
Well, there's of course a big group, possibly as big or possibly bigger, of people who will never vote for him as the people who will vote for him. So both parties have become about exciting their base, which just means getting the most fervent believers out to vote. This is what made Hillary Clinton lose the election. She was unable to excite the Democratic base in 2016. Trump knows that. Trump understands very well his own election. He's probably the biggest aficionado of the 2016 election, given that he won. And he wants to repeat that. And it's really unclear. It's unclear what he's thinking. We obviously can't guess at that. But it's unclear whether it will work for him, and also whether if he loses the House and keeps the Senate, as is expected, whether that will be beneficial for him in 2020. Some have speculated that he's thinking it will be, and he's fine with that result. But it's interesting speculation, but it is speculation.
All right, Michael Jones, let me get your view on this. You know, as you pointed out earlier on, the numbers for the president are very good. There was some good news for the president on Friday morning with the jobs numbers. Let's listen to what the president said. And he said this in passing, but let's watch.
I will say that we had tremendous job numbers today. It was just released 250,000 new jobs created in the month of October. That was shocking.
So, Michael, why isn't the president talking about this every minute of the day?
He has been talking about it very extensively at his rallies and in Washington, D.C. I think there is a media fixation on immigration in the sense that this caravan is sort of testing American will. And so that also has received a lot of attention. And I think because you have a Democratic Party that generally is refusing to defend our border security personnel, has supported sanctuary cities, has generally been champions of illegal immigration, even when it's been at the expense of American citizens and American security and safety, it's inevitably a political issue, and it's a pretty significant one. You know, for 2 years, the Democratic Party's more or less been talking pretty extensively about Russia, and you notice over the last few months, there's almost been no mention of that, and that's because it is not registered with the American people as an issue. But immigration does register with the American people as an issue. The economy clearly does. And on immigration, the American people want the border secured. They want our immigration system to be orderly and structured. They want to see cities complying with our federal immigration laws, and they want an end to illegal alien crime. Those are all reasonable expectations, and the president's championed those. The Democratic Party, I think to its political detriment, has generally opposed them.
Colin, do you agree with that, that at the uppermost in people's minds when they go into that voting booth on Tuesday will be immigration?
No, but I'll tell you this. You're asking why is he talking about that and not economics. You can't yell lock her up if you're talking about economics. Yeah. One thing President Trump does know how to do really well is he knows how to strike a nerve with people that like him, people that don't. And I think he's made the strategic choice that if he talked about his record with the economy, which is enviable for anybody of any party in a midterm election, people will say, yeah, they're happy, but that doesn't get people out to vote. What he does know is these cultural divides that he puts us through. One, you may be swayed on healthcare, the economy, or military, whatever, if you hear a convincing argument. But if you believe a certain way on immigration, if you believe that the caravan's full of MS-13, then that's not going to change for Tuesday.
Let's listen to the argument on immigration. This is what the president has been saying. He said this at one of his campaign rallies. Let's watch this.
A vote for Democrats is a vote to liquidate America's borders, and it's a vote to let meth, fentanyl, heroin, and other deadly drugs pour across our borders, drugs that take the lives of think of this, over 70,000 Americans a year.
What do you make of that?
Well, if I follow his logic, Democrats are responsible for the opioid epidemic. But once again, I think that he's trying to paint a black and white issue that he knows will energize his base. But what I also see is that if you really look at it, it's inconsistent. Because when he gave his speech yesterday talking about the principles of, changing the birthright citizenship, to taking the military down there to stop the caravan, he said he wants it orderly. So he said he wants those people that want to come to the caravan. He said, bring them because we need workers. And I said, but I thought they were all MS-13 and criminals. So it's like, you can't paint them all with one brush and then say you're open to immigration of the kind that you want.
Okay, Michael, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, the fentanyl and opioid problem is immense. A very large percentage of that has been crossing our porous southern border. Securing that border is a reflection of being serious in stopping the flow of these deadly drugs. The number of fatalities that the president cited, which he's correct on, is like over 20 times each year the number of Americans who were lost in Iraq. That resonates with the American people. I think most American voters know someone or know someone who knows someone who's been affected by this crisis. They want to see it stopped, and border security is absolutely an essential component of that. It's very difficult to talk seriously about an anti-drug and anti-opioid campaign when your position is leaving that southern border open.
Zhang, I want to get back to an issue you mentioned a moment ago, and that is the escalating trade dispute between China and the United States. The president has been talking about it. This is what he said.
We've had very good discussions with China. We're getting much closer to doing something. They very much want to make a deal. As you know, their economy went way down since we've been doing this skirmish. I spoke with President Xi yesterday. They very much want to make a deal.
So here we have an international issue between the United States and China, but it has a domestic dimension, doesn't it? Because it affects, we've seen this, it affects farmers in the Midwest. We know that exports of soybeans from the United States to China have been cut, pretty big cuts. So how does that trade dispute factor into this election? Will it?
I think so. And as you said already, those states with soybeans being exported to China, those people over there are getting frustrated. And also, I think some tariff President Trump charged China is also affecting people's kind of mind, especially like steel or some other goods are getting more expensive, which is making different things here in America to be more expensive. And I think he made a correct decision by calling President Xi to offer a kind of discussion in G20, I think, summit. And he wanted to make a deal with President Xi that is benefiting both him and President Xi. And I think he wanted to get some deal done with Chinese side, and to make him to tell his supporters I'm doing a good job for you, and the trade issue will be over, and American people will be happy after this dispute. I think he's trying to reduce his supporters' kind of frustration
and anxiety, because the people that this trade dispute is hurting here in the United States are farmers in the Midwest. They make up his constituency.
Yes, people are starting to feel the kind of pain. But if he will move ahead with what he said is $267 billion more tariff, as I heard from people, it's going to be very nasty for American ordinary kind of consumers. So I think he's trying to figure out a way to solve this problem.
Rafael, a few more days before the election, and we hear a lot about turnout, voter turnout during this election. How important will turnout be in this election?
Turnout is huge, especially in this election. If you compare it to 2014, that was a pretty boring election, really. There wasn't all that much up in dispute. Turnout just wasn't great. For the Latino community, for example, there weren't any seats in dispute in California, and so many Latinos live in California that just that lower turnout over there meant that Latinos didn't come out, which meant that Democrats didn't invest as much in Latinos for 2016. So that's one side. The other side is we're already seeing it. In early voting in Texas, you have 200,000 people have already voted who had never voted before. So the polls are going to be strange because the polls only measure people who voted before in other elections. Sometimes the super voters that they call that vote in every single election, then the frequent voters, and they usually ignore the rest. If you have that big number, then you will see differences from what the polls tell you to what the results are. So I would expect surprises. We don't know in what direction they'll go.
From what we know at this stage, do we know which party is better is better at organizing a better voter turnout?
I would say the Democrats have a more visible and better ground game. They've put in more of an effort. The Republicans, though, you cannot discount the Republicans. The Republicans, since the creation of the Tea Party, they've been very good at getting out their base voters. Their base voters don't miss an election. And in 2016, Trump had this special connection with a lot of voters who had never voted before. And you saw him win Wisconsin, Michigan, Florida, states that the Democrats felt either very confident or relatively confident. So it's both parties to a certain extent at their best.
And the Democrats have Oprah.
All right, they do. I'm going to get you in a moment, Calvin. I just want to get your response to that, Michael Johns. You're a co-founder of the Tea Party. You just heard that the Tea Party has played no small role in getting the Republican vote out. What about this election?
Well, a key part to Tea Party victories in 2010, which took back the House, in 2014, which took back the U.S. Senate, was also the ability to motivate independent voters around conservative and populist conservative themes. And I think they continue to stand by this president. Republican turnout in this early voting measured so far has been larger than anticipated and larger than in historical years. That's a very positive sign. And I think the enthusiasm and support for the president within the party has not suffered. In fact, it's basically hovered in the 51% area lately. And that's a positive sign that those supportive of the president are sufficiently motivated. They, too, know that a lot is at stake on Tuesday.
Calvin, here's what we know so far. As Rafael pointed out a moment ago, the number of voters, or early voters, I should say, it's much more than the midterms in 2014 and as high as the presidential election in 2016. So what does that tell you?
Well, it says that there's a lot of enthusiasm just in general. But what I also think is important is, while we've talked a lot about President Trump and Congress, there are a couple of other races in this country that are really mobilizing young people, particular minorities. The governorships in Florida and in Georgia, and to some extent in Texas. So I think that one of the things I'm seeing that I haven't seen before in midterms is that people are emphasizing that some of the biggest changes that we need to make are on the state level. Governorship, state legislators. Yeah.
Michael Jones, another a possible outcome that we've been talking about is that the Democrats take the House and the Republicans retain the Senate. If we had that, we've got a divided Congress. Will we then see more gridlock like we saw for many years during the Obama administration?
Yeah, I think most of the focus on that, I think that's sort of an established conventional wisdom, and of course conventional wisdoms were proven wrong in 2016. That would, I think, make it more difficult for the president to advance his agenda, obviously in the House. But that's the obvious fact. The not so obvious fact is that as 2020 is approaching, it's also going to force Democrats into a position of having to show some accomplishment for this victory if they do in fact achieve one. And I think that should force some degree of moderation, some degree of very much needed bipartisanship on themes where those can be reached, and kind of a purging of its more radical oriented rhetoric. So in some respects, as much as it would be politically detrimental to the president to lose the House, it could begin a reformation of the Democratic Party that could actually end up being generally constructive from the standpoint of getting Democrats to at least be a little more open-minded and working with the president.
Rafael, that's a point you mentioned earlier on, that a win for the Democrats in the House could be beneficial for the president in 2020. But to Michael's point about the fact that the Democrats don't want to be known as the party of no, as the Republicans were during the Obama years.
Well, it depends on how you measure success. And the way I gauge Democrats right now, and this is granted before the 20 to 40 new Democrats come in, because you will see about that many. They need 23 to take over. The way they're talking right now, their success will be measured by stopping President Trump's, as what they view as his most egregious policies on immigration, possibly on defending abortion rights. So they will use the oversight powers of the House of Representatives in a very aggressive way. If they're viewed as weak, they stand to lose their base. And at this point, Democrats can't go much lower than they did after 2016. That is a low point for them.